Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to Between Two Somms. I'm here once again with one of my favorite people in the world, Jesse Becker. He's a brand manager, which really isn't a very good description of all the things he does for craft and estate. He does so many things between, yes, manage portfolio items, but help research new items and certainly educate a whole lot of other professionals as he wanders the country. And it's always a pleasure, Jesse, to join you on one of these conversations and share some of our passions with the rest of the world out there who loves wine. Note that this topic is not a surfing topic. Well, it could be a windsurfing topic, but I don't know how to do that. Hey, Jesse.
Hey, we're right on the Mediterranean Sea today, so I'm sure you can find some surf there, and we could incorporate that a little bit. So I'm really happy that we're speaking about Provence today, Ron. And Ron, did you already say I should introduce you? You're our education director for our entire organization, and it's always a pleasure to have a chance to do this with you, to meet with you, and just discuss topics in wine that we really love and have a passion for. So, and our topic today is Provence, which is just a beautiful place, and given where we are right now, I'd sure like to be right in that spot. And there's just something sort of magical about Provence. And I sort of, when I'm tasting a rosé from like Côtes de Provence, it just sort of takes me to the place, which is exactly what a great wine should do. So I don't know, I sort of start to think about all these things like the landscape. You'll see these fields of lavender, and the architecture here is very distinctive from anywhere else in France. And so, I mean, the tile roofs, but just also the colors that they choose to paint the homes and the businesses and buildings with there. It's just has a very sort of distinct look to it. And then, of course, the cuisine of Provence is very distinctive. The market stands are just filled with all kinds of wonderful looking fruits and vegetables, but then the cuisine itself, it's so influenced by olive oil and garlic, and you get this kind of sometimes a really sort of intensely garlicky aioli that goes with their fish, and it's just it's a very distinctive cuisine from the rest of France. And then, of course, the rosé wine. So
yeah, and when when I think of Provence, I sort of feel like Provence is France's version, until you get to the Caribbean, of course, France's version of island time, right? It's just a much more relaxed, it feels like a place you should slow down, walk a little slower, talk a little slower, sit by the fountain, put your wine in the fountain and drink a glass of rosé. And rosé is consumed in this house very regularly. And part of it is because even a sip of it gives you that sort of feeling. And so we should always have Provence somewhere near our topic of conversation. So let's get to it.
Well, we already talked about this stuff earlier when we spoke about the Southern Rhone, because this is very much also the landscape you see in the Southern Rhone, but this is Garrigue, and I wanted to revisit it here because this is all over the place in Provence. It's sort of, when you see the landscape sort of change to this wild sort of shrubbery with all sorts of wild thyme and rosemary and lavender and sage. Not only can you just visually see that you're in Provence, but the air sort of smells like this. And then on top of that, sometimes you'll get this sort of herbaceous quality in the wines themselves. And so I think it's an important feature of what Provence is all about, this Garrigue.
Yeah, I love how the book I was reading, to just refresh my memory on a bunch of things, listed this as a resinous shrub. It's like all these resinous shrubs, like, the essential oils just eke out of these things into the air and into everything around them. And it is a fabulous smell. So yeah, takes me right there.
Well, maybe a bit of history here that we could spend all day on history with Provence, because it is France's oldest wine region. The Phocaeans founded, which is are the Greeks, founded the city. They called it Massalia, but founded Marseille in the 2,600 years ago. And they brought the grapevine here, and so we can call Provence the oldest wine region in France where wine sort of originated in France. And then the Romans, of course, were here, and very importantly, this was a Roman province, so thus Provence. We see all over Provence these ruins and evidence of their being here. So the Provincia Romana, and of course, like elsewhere in Europe, once Rome falls, really the responsibility of wine growing and winemaking and just carrying on that knowledge sort of fell to the church at this point. And so we see evidence of that all over as well. And then yes, Phylloxera arrives here, and I like to bring this up here because you know, for definitely sort of post-Phylloxera, and then we have this war period, and then post-war period. A lot of the wines that were coming out of Provence were from cooperatives, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But one thing that we saw is that it sort of started to turn towards maybe more mass production, and just the wines, you know, one thing Jancis Robinson wrote was that they were overly alcoholic and underflavored, or something like that, to something to that extent, and that sort of typified a lot of the wines that came out of Provence in this sort of post-war period, post-Phylloxera. So,
well, what's interesting though is that they replanted it in the late 19th century, and then by the time the 1930s came along, those vines had sort of outlived most of their usefulness. So they were starting to replant, and they happened to be starting to replant right about the same time that the AOC system was instituted. And so they had kind of a leg up in going back to quality, which was the intention, as they went back to quality, which is an interesting thing to see the cycle in an area that has so much history, right? Because Provence was the first Roman colony. It was their first outside Roman colony. This place has been making wine for a really long time. And to see that sort of ebb and flow and where it is today with the quality that comes out of there now for the relative value of price is pretty amazing.
Well, speaking of appellation control here, we do actually find some of the smaller appellations that we'll get to in a moment that are quite old and very established, but that's sort of a surprising thing to see that the Côtes de Provence appellation was only put into place in 1977, so relatively new. And the Côtes de Provence appellation is 75% of all Provençal wines bottled. So it's a very important, very large and expansive appellation. So it's everything from Marseille going in the east towards Nice. And look at that fact. That doesn't really surprise me though. 90% of the wines of this Côtes de Provence appellation are rosé. No surprise there.
It's actually interesting because even anciently, this region was known for light pink wines. I mean, that's what was being made there even in 2,000 years ago. So it's really interesting that it hung on so long, even as people moved into red wines. And I also love this picture you found because it is not an immediate assumption on our part that you would have these white calcareous limestone style rock formations in Provence. We think it would probably be something else. Maybe it's sand, maybe it's this, but it's really interesting how you have kind of three majors there, but the two of the three majors are limestone and schist, which is really fascinating because you don't expect it.
Yeah, in fact, the Côtes de Provence has been divided into 5 subzones, and I have a slide dedicated to that in just a moment. So we can look at that, and of course, there's a large variance in soil types and terroir. So that's you're absolutely right. The terrain and the soil is more diverse than you might assume. Oh, one other thing while we're on this slide, this is another thing I find really interesting about Provence is that, yeah, we have these grape varieties that maybe we would say are typical Provençal varieties, but there's also a mix of international grapes to be found in Provence. And look at some of these, we even have some Italian grapes like Vermentino. It goes by a different name here. Typically, the name of Roll is what they use, but you'll find a mix sort of international varieties, and then of course grapes that like Grenache and so Syrah, Mourvedre that make up the big percentage of rosé that's produced here. But a great sort of diversity of grape varieties as well. So just to have a look here, I wanted to sort of highlight that there are these subzones within Côtes de Provence. There's 5 of them now, with the addition of Notre Dame des Anges in 2019. And these have been sort of established based on soil type and terroir and climate of their respective zones. And just to point out a few of them, you can see that there's limestone soil in Sainte-Victoire. There's more of this quartz and schist in Lalande. And actually Lalande is where our producer is based, Figuière. So they're very much all about expressing the specificity of Lalande, but we get volcanic soil in Fréjus, and then Pierrefonds, that seems like fire rock, I guess, but shell soils, and so these are the subzones of the Côtes de Provence. Another huge appellation here is the Coteaux d'Aix in Provence, which established in 1985. That's the city of Aix in Provence. And another large appellation, sort of the western part of Provence. So, and again, 82% of what's produced here is rosé, but you do find certainly some whites and reds, a lot of it produced from Roule and Grenache, and the typical varieties of the regions. Everything we see in blue here is Aix and en Provence. Mm-hmm. Just another appellation here to mention for the sake of completeness, we have the Coteaux Varois en Provence, established in '93, sort of focused around the town of Bandol, and 90% rosé here, a little bit cooler climate, so much so that Louis Latour, the producer in Burgundy, grows Pinot Noir here, very interesting, but sort of a sheltered area, limestone soils, so, and you can see where that is on the map here. And then
I actually got wine from there this week. My wife bought a bottle of wine at the store, and it came home and it was that appellation. I was like, well, perfect timing.
Perfect timing, that's great.
And it felt like, you know how they kind of divide their wines into sort of like, drink it today, it's refreshing. This is like mouth-watering, you know, don't take it too seriously, it's just rosé, to ageable. And it was in that, this is fun and delightful, but you know, that sort of rosé.
Very nice. Ron, you know, I wanted to kind of take a break from the appellation discussion to talk about this. In my conversation that I had recently with Magali Combard from Figuière in Provence, we had a discussion about the style of rosé that we find throughout France and really all over the world now, and how they're made differently in Provence. And one technique that we see on this chart that we hardly ever encounter in Provence is saignée. And just to explain that, that's a bleeding off of a red wine vat. It helps concentrate the color and intensity of flavor of the red wine that you're producing, but as a byproduct, you get this this rosé that is maybe more common in other regions, but Magali explained to me it's hardly ever used here in Provence. What Provence is known for is this really pale colored rosé. I sometimes describe it as like a melon color, but there's an official chart of colors. We'll get to that in a second, but the reason it has such a pale color is the technique, and you can see it's almost always produced in a sort of a press method, or just even a short maceration on the skins with free run juice. So very short macerations here. You can see they have 2 to 20 hours, but they're so pale that you have to imagine they're on the lower end of that in terms of maceration time.
Yeah, and I think the big difference, if you're looking at this chart from the outside in, is just understanding the difference between rosé by intention from the very beginning, meaning these vineyards were manicured and cultivated to make rosé. So we make rosé like the 3 left side. And then there's we make red wine, but it'd be nice to have a rosé. And here's one way to do it, which helps our red wine and gives us a rosé at the same time. None of these, by the way, I would say in the world scope is a bad method. It just, rosé by intention starts at the vineyard and ends in the winery. And it's a very different approach than the Sanier thought process.
Yeah, yeah. There's a reason that Provençal rosé has just it has this very delicate pale color, but this just this beautiful sort of slash of flavor, and it's the kind of perfect foil, I think, for the cuisine here as well. So there's the sort of what they're putting out there as their range of colors that they produce, but oftentimes I find it's more on the very, very pale end of the color spectrum, so that melon color or the peach maybe. But yeah, that's what typifies rosé in Provence.
Yeah, my kind of experience is that it goes up through that, what was that, the one after melon. And
Manqué.
Yeah.
Manqué.
Pomelo, yeah, pomelo. And the other thing I think is interesting is that because of the popularity of rosé from Provence, other areas of the world are being forced into a box that says your rosé is supposed to look like that, which is really interesting to me.
Well, it is true, and you know, in Greece, Ron, you are very passionate about Greek wine. You know that the rosés there actually have quite a lot more color to them. They're fantastic with, especially like if you're having a charred octopus salad, you want that sort of more intense flavor, but also the sort of the grip that you get from those wines. And so, yeah, I think there's a place for those dark colored rosés. I happen to really love Schiava and Vernaccia from Alto Adige. It's a red wine, but so pale in color, it might as well be a deeply colored rosé, and they're so useful at the table. So I like the range and the spectrum of rosé that's out there.
Me too. I think they all have different applications.
Yeah, sort of I think a very important AOC here, once a subzone of Coteaux d'Aix in Provence. This is Les Baux de Provence and home to Domaine de Trébillon. Very, very important producer here. Excellent wines all around, but sort of known for their reds. And there's even some great international varieties here. So Cabernet Sauvignon can do really well here. And I would imagine that's a probably pretty, I've never been to that town, but probably a pretty tourist friendly place.
I want to go. That's gorgeous. And interestingly, you know, Les Baux comes from the original language of BAUX, as you show on the screen, which is the root word of bauxite, because this whole area is full of aluminum ore.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know.
Aluminum ore got its name from the town of Baux.
Wow. Very interesting.
Things you read when you're trying to study wine. It's fascinating. But yeah.
So this is, it's not, we don't even have a detailed enough map to see this, but it's here in the very western extent of Aix in Provence. But now we can get into some of these small individual appellations like Palette. And for sure, I mean, I think the only Palette I ever see in the US is Chateau Simon. They must be for sure the dominant producer here. But north-facing limestone terroir east of Aix-en-Provence, and that probably has this name because literally it's a palette of grape varieties to produce red, white, and rosé from.
And my memory serves that this is one of the appellations there that actually is more red wine than anything else. Is that your memory too?
Yeah, and they use a lot of different grape varieties here. I mean, more so than even like Chateauneuf de Pape. So these can have many varieties.
Yeah, it was a laundry list. I'm like, no, I'm not going to remember that.
Oh, right.
Yes. I love this.
Oh yeah. And Ron, I believe you've been in Cassis maybe for a little lunch, and tell us about your experience here.
20 years ago, we came out of Bandol and drove through the hillside, which you can see when you look up Cassis online. You literally come over this ridge and you kind of weave your way into this sun trap that ends in that. And this memory immediately came back that that building right there with the green shutters is where we ate on the second floor. And the worst part about it, we wanted to order bouillabaisse, and they said, no, bouillabaisse you have to order day before. I was like, what? That's crazy.
Funny you say that, because I kind of think of the, especially the white here, to be sort of the classic Perrier for bouillabaisse, which is of course this this fantastic fish stew that you get all over the south of France, but specifically in Provence and Marseille. And yeah, I find that white of Cassis to be particularly good with bouillabaisse. It sort of always has a sort of herbaceousness to it, but you can see made from Marsanne, Claret, and other white varieties. But
yeah,
very charming place, very old appellation. That would have been one of the very first appellations.
one of the first. And you know, it's not very many places in France that you can find Marsanne as a dominant, or at least a mainstay blending variety. So it's a pretty cool opportunity to try. If you run across one of these wines in the marketplace, make sure you try it. They're interesting for sure.
Yeah. Now, I have a little story to tell about Bellet, which is actually around the outskirts of Nice, sort of surrounding the city of Nice. I visited Nice on vacation a few years ago, and of course, whenever I'm in a place, I always seek out the local wine, want to experience what they do right in that place. And I went to the several wine shops, was looking on wine lists, and I was just so surprised that Bellet is quite expensive. You know, not what you would expect to pay for a very pleasant, very nice wine, but not. It just seemed like it was several euros more than it should have been.
Right.
And what I think the explanation is here is that you can see that the city of Nice is sort of encroaching on the vineyards, and so there could be a little bit of competition with the city itself. But I think it's also anywhere that's a sort of a tourist destination, and this drives up the price of these wines. So the local wine of the city of Nice here is Bellet.
There you go. And it's isn't this one's made from that really interesting red varietal that carries a lot of rose petal flavor profile, and I'm blanking out on the name all of a sudden.
Briquette.
Briquette, yes,
Yep.
Briquette, which is, I looked it up to make sure it wasn't Brachetto from right across the border. It is not. It's its own thing.
Ah, okay.
So,
Yeah, and the whites here from Roll, which is of course it's Vermentino, but and I had to find a different map here because it's all the way here in the east, in surrounding the city of Nice. So, and then for sure I think most probably one of the most famous appellations, famous wines that comes from Provence is this incredible wine from Bandol, which is another port town right on the Mediterranean. But for sure, one of the most recognizable and prestigious appellations here. So you get these very tiny, area, but these terraces that face south, surrounding the port town of Bandol. Of course, they make all three colors here, but it's probably most famous for its red, the red version. But rosé can be excellent here as well. And this is one place where we very famously see high percentages of Mourvèdre as sort of almost a varietal expression of Mourvèdre. And Bandol, very expressive of its terroir. I just think of those single vineyards that come from Tempier that are always so interesting to taste. But I would say, in my experience, these wines definitely need time in bottle to, sort of develop and to soften, because it can be quite a brawny, muscular red wine. But love Bandol. It's got so much character.
it's great wine, and it is character is a good way to put it, because what characters you love in wine is really going to be individualistic, and Mourvèdre is one of those grapes, especially in this environment, that offers you a more savory form of wine, a little more like eating and a little less like drinking. And it has everything from meat derived sort of aroma and flavor into herbal, and then comes in with the fruit. And it's just a fascinating beverage. And I agree with you. The ones I've had that really, I'm like, wow, we're 10 years old or more. And in their first couple of years of life, they're a fine beverage, but they don't really show themselves all that well until later. And it's just really fascinating to me that even their rosés actually age really well.
Yeah.
A couple, 3-4 years on a rosé from Bandol is no problem. So as a buyer, it's really smart. You look through the inventory list and you say, oh, inventory reduction list on Bandol rosé, I'm in. You know,
Yeah, no
this is
kidding.
probably going to be okay. But we hopefully won't have that problem ourselves. But you know, it's an interesting, fascinating, history-laden place when you're there. You can just sort of feel that you're surrounded by antiquity. It's very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, and just again on that red Bandol, what it becomes as it ages, it's Mourvedre kind of on its own has sort of a wildness to it, but it really develops that, that sort of spice and almost truffle character. And anyway, great wine, Bandol. And you can see just once again another small coastal area near Marseille, and we have in our portfolio the wines of Phylloxera. This is a fantastic producer in the Côtes de Provence, specifically from the subzone of La Londe, which we mentioned earlier. These wines are really defined by the proximity to the sea. They're right next to the Mediterranean, and they're schistty soil. So it's a very distinctive style of Côtes de Provence here from our organic producer, Phylloxera.
Yep.
And
I don't think a week goes by anywhere between, I don't know, February and November here that one of these doesn't get opened at our house. My wife and I both love these wines, not because we sell them, because they're delicious. Really great, perfect examples of what you should get out of Provence Rosé.
You say February and rosé. I'm the exact same way. I'm always just a little too early when I start craving these wines. It's the same thing with Barolo though too. I always start to think about it like in the August, September, and you really should wait a little longer.
I don't know. The perfect time for
time.
Barolo is when one's nearby.
Exactly.
If there's Barolo nearby, it's a good time. If there's Provence Rosé nearby, it's a good time. Hey, yeah, you have a recording with her that we can send people to.
Yeah, absolutely. Just check our Winebo's YouTube channel for a very recent interview I did with Magali Combard, owner of Phylloxera in Côtes de Provence. Fascinating discussion. She'll tell you all about the cuisine and the terrain and the Mediterranean. So if you really want to transport yourself virtually to Provence right now, I recommend the interview. Pop open a glass of rosé, and she'll take you there. So.
Yeah, and her French accent's much better than ours.
Yes, exactly. Ron, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, to have this discussion about Provence. I really enjoy doing these Between Two Somms with you, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yes, we will let everybody know when the next one's about to be around, so keep in touch. It'll be a few weeks, but we're coming back to it. Don't worry. And thank you, everybody. It's always my pleasure, Jesse.